In this video, I'm going to talk about the behavioral part of the Amazon interview when it comes to project management roles, both technical and non-technical. And if you came here just for the questions, here's a list with the most common behavioral questions that Amazon asks projects managers during the interview. And by the way, I also place these questions in the video description right next to that like button. Now, the main reason why I'm making an entire video on this topic is because the behavioral part of the Amazon interview is quite different when it comes to project management roles. And when I say different from, for instance, from SD roles, which I covered in my previous video, where questions were clearly in three categories: success, failure, and team stories. And for project management roles, they all seem to be around teamwork and more team-oriented, which is actually the bread and butter of this role. So the same as with SD roles, there are success and failure stories, and the main highlight here is in the way that these questions are being asked. For example, if in the case of an SD, a success story question might be framed like, tell me about your greatest success, the same would be framed for a project manager about tell me about your strengths. And another example here, tell me about your greatest failure in the case of an SD role, while in the case of a project manager, it could be simply tell me about your weaknesses. So very important here is to first understand why they're asking you this question, to understand their main goal when asking you to prepare a story for this. And last but not least, don't forget the theory here. I mean, the main reason why companies are using behavioral questions because your past behavior is thought to be a great predictor of future behavior. So at least this is the theory. Now, if you're new to behavioral interviewing, you should know that there's an approach to prepare for these things, and that is to work on a few stories that will basically serve you as a platform to answer any behavioral question. Now, truth be told, you can also go ahead and answer each and every behavioral question from my previous list, and you'll still earn a good amount of proficiency. However, I believe that that approach is a bit short-sighted. So also, if you want, I made an example of such a story in another video. It's with a failure story, so go check that out if you want. Now, each of these stories must have a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And this is something that's called the STAR method. So keep that in mind, that whenever answering such a question, you must have these three parts. Now, back to the questions. As I already mentioned, most of them are team related. So when the interviewer is asking you such questions, they are mainly looking for your leadership skills, for your time management skills, for your interpersonal skills, and your overall ability to handle conflict. And for example, they might ask you for a failure or a success story in the context of a team. But they could also ask you a question of a failure or success outside the context of your team, to which your leadership skills and your other skills will still apply. Such, for example, tell me about your best innovation in the past 2 years. Let me set the record straight here. It's quite unlikely you've never worked in a team if you're applying for a project management role. And the reason why I'm saying this is because you'll be surprised how many people enter in lockdown mode immediately after being asked a behavioral question, such as, what are your strengths or what are your weaknesses? So my main point here is to, of course, take your time to think about an answer, but this shouldn't be more than just a couple of seconds. And if you have the slightest doubt about that question, just simply answer follow-up questions. And another approach here to avoid these quiet periods is to simply start brainstorming out loud, because what's really important about the behavioral interview is how you present the information. And your end goal here is to put together a great show into which you highlight your strengths and you as a great fit inside the company. The interviewer is a lot more interested in this part of your story than in the details themselves. And by the way, if you want an example, I did one in a previous video for a failure story, where as soon as I determined what should be the structure of my story, I tried to keep it engaging while relevant and inviting for follow-up questions as a start to a proper conversation. The main difference between these two roles when it comes to behavioral questions is not necessarily in the questions themselves, but in the way that you should answer them. Because for instance, in the case of non-technical roles, there is a tendency to focus a lot more on customer centricity, when by contrast for technical roles, project managers are a lot more about buzzwords such as agile, because they pretty much have to run a team of software developers. So again, the questions are the same, so the list applies to both jobs, but the answer should differ. And just to give you an example here, when answering a question, what are your strengths, you should give an answer that highlights your customer centricity in the case of the non-technical project management role. And by the way, you should also triple check in your position description, because what I'm saying, it does not apply to 100% of these cases. Now, also your story must follow the STAR format, that is to have a beginning, a middle, and an ending. So it's very important that you don't forget one of these parts of the stories, because it's interpreted as not being prepared, technically prepared to answer with this technique. And also, of course, you shouldn't go over the 2 minutes threshold, and you should also try to keep it engaged, relevant, and concise. And by the way, in both cases, try to use metrics, because Amazon is a metrics-rich business. The best way to characterize the way that you're presenting your story here is diplomatic, and I believe this is an important keyword to understand, because this will also help you to score points as resolving conflict and interpersonal skills in general. All 14 leadership principles apply for project management roles, and the reason why I'm highlighting this is because in the case of SD roles, I managed to cut this list into half to only 7 principles, but here I believe you should read the whole list. And by the way, you should read it at least a few times, because I've heard of instances where the interviewer would ask questions such as, what's your favorite leadership principle? So of course, practice is your best friend, and practicing with friends is also a very good idea. If not, videotaping yourself is also something that I've heard to be working quite well. Now, if I have to give you some less traditional advice, try reading a few biographies, autobiographies of US presidents, for instance. Obama's Dreams from My Father is quite a quick read, or George Bush's autobiography is well written, and also if you have more time than Bill Clinton is also one that I would recommend. And last but not least, even if Amazon's interview is designed to uncover false positives, I believe the best way to measure the quality of an interviewee and of an interviewer itself is by how well the conversation and the exchange evolved. So my last piece of advice here would be to also prepare some questions for them eventually at the end of the on-site interview, because that's also a great indicator of how good of a fit you are inside Amazon. Thank you very much for watching.